Welcome to Let's Talk Democracy. I'm Tina Johnson, your host. Join me as we talk to the people on the front lines, the change makers and activists who are building a stronger, healthier democracy for all of us. Whether you're looking for expert advice, a new perspective, or just a little inspiration, this is where you'll find it. On this podcast, we talk a lot about testing democracy, not as an idea, but as a system. Attention, trust, decision-making. But testing still implies distance, a way of looking at something without fully being inside it. This episode is different because now we are no longer stepping back to analyze democracy. We're stepping into it. And once you are inside it, it doesn't look the same. Democracy is often described as a structure, institutions, rules, processes. But from the inside, it feels less like a structure and more like a condition, something that only exists while it is actively being maintained. So in this episode, we move closer from observation to participation, from model to lived reality. And we begin to ask a different kind of question. What does democracy actually feel like when you are inside it? Let's get into it. In the previous episode, I said that the second half of season 3 would focus on real-world efforts to strengthen democracy, and we are going to do that. But before we move forward, I want to take a moment to pause because this podcast has now been running for 1 year. And I feel that if we're going to shift towards solutions, it's worth asking what these conversations over the past year have actually shown us, not individually, but collectively. What patterns emerge when we step back from the episodes and look at the system they were describing? Over the past year, this podcast has explored democracy from multiple angles. But I don't think of these conversations as separate. I actually think of them as building blocks, that they're building something together, a way of understanding how democratic systems hold and how they begin to break down. The first layer of that understanding is perception. In the episode, Authoritarian Populism and the Crisis of Perception, I spoke with Professor Thomas Weber about how political reality itself is becoming fragmented. And he said, when perception becomes fragmented, politics doesn't just polarize, it destabilizes. That idea reframes everything because we are no longer only dealing with disagreement. We are dealing with a breakdown in shared reality, a weakening of the common ground that democratic debate depends on. And once that ground disappears, democracy doesn't just become more polarized, it becomes harder to recognize as a shared system at all. And I think that's important because that is the crux of what is happening in the democratic countries. We are no longer able to recognize a shared system, but instead we are seeing a fragmentation. And it's important to remember that this fragmentation does not happen in isolation. It's happening because it is being amplified. In the megaphone effect, I spoke with Professor Lisa Schurch about digital systems shaping public discourse. And she said social media doesn't just reflect public opinion, it intensifies it. It turns up the volume on the most extreme signals in the system. And that connects directly to Weber. Because fragmentation is not only happening, it's being accelerated, scaled, repeated, reinforced. And that is contributing to the ground disappearing and democracy becoming more polarized, which is making it harder for us to recognize a shared system. So when we talk about a crisis of perception, we are also talking about amplification, a feedback loop, where fractured perception spreads faster than shared understanding can rebuild itself. But perception is only one layer, because democracy is also about how reality is maintained over time. In securing democracy at the ballot box, Kathy Boockvar, the former Secretary of State for Pennsylvania, said democracy is not self-executing. It only works if people and institutions actively maintain it. And for me, that reframes democracy entirely. It moves it from abstract idea to operational system, something that depends on continuous maintenance. Systems, procedures, institutions. If you listen to this podcast for a while, you know that I believe in the power of the vote, as we just witnessed in Hungary with the recent elections this week. Trust in mechanisms that often remain invisible when they work properly. Democracy, in that sense, is an infrastructure. When democracy works, we don't think about the mechanisms that make it function because it works. And because democracy is an infrastructure, sometimes it needs to be repaired. Sometimes it needs to get maintenance. Because I think it's important to remember that institutions are not fixed. They evolve. And challenging the norms, when I spoke with Joe Holtz, the former general manager of the Park Slope Food Cooperative in New York, he said, in a co-op, decision-making isn't something that happens to people. It's something members actively participate in. And that should matter. Because institutions are not just structures. They are lived systems. Democracies are supposed to be lived systems where people participate continuously rather than occasionally, embedded rather than distant. But participation only has meaning under conditions of equality. And when we see equality for one group of people being stripped away, it is fair to say that it's being stripped away for everyone. Jackie Patterson talked about this in the episode Where Human Rights Meet Democracy. I remember this clearly when she said, democracy cannot be separated from justice. If people are excluded from basic rights, their participation in democracy is fundamentally constrained. Again, that reframes democracy. Participation is not enough. So yes, I'm a proponent of voting. It's very important to vote, but the conditions matter. Can people vote? Do they have access? Are their voices equal to, leveled with? Are the conditions fair, or are the conditions uneven? I was surprised by my conversation with Jim Boyce because we were talking about the gross domestic product. He's an economist, and I was surprised by his words when he said GDP tells us something about economic activity, but it tells us very little about well-being, equality, or environmental sustainability. Surprised that an economist is thinking about this, but really happy to hear that an economist is thinking about this, thinking about what we measure and how what we measure shapes what we prioritize. And what we prioritize shapes democracy itself. So democracy is also shaped by economic values, not just political systems. And being aware of how these intersect with one another is increasingly important to understanding where the power exists within the democratic system. And another layer to this is understanding how democracy is shaped. Vemba Dizolele in the episode Democracy in Flux said, "What happens externally often shapes what is possible internally." That expands the frame: historical, economic, geopolitical. I think another layer that's important is that democracy is not only rules. Mark Wallace in the episode Empire and Faith said political identity and religious identity are deeply intertwined in ways that shape how democracy itself is understood and legitimized. Why? Again, because democracy is not only rules, it is meaning. A story about who we are, what this system is for, and when that story fractures, everything becomes harder to stabilize. The story of we stabilizes the story of us, the story of our systems. And when we see this story fractured, and I would argue that making migration or immigration a political talking point, that is a fracture that is creating a destabilization in the story, the narrative of the we, which then causes the we to question the system, who the system is for, what is the system for, and that it's intentional. And that narrative plays into why it is that we tend to vote against our own self-interest. I really appreciated the episode with Blair Talmadge, his perspective as a political strategist, and the episode of why we vote against ourselves. And he said people don't always vote against their interests. They vote according to how those interests are framed, understood, and prioritized. Political behavior is interpretation. It's, again, that narrative, trust, identity. Things that can bind us together or things that can create that fragmentation, that destabilization when used as a policy approach, when our narrative and our trust and our identity become political behavior to be interpreted. It again is, in my opinion, an intentional way in which we destabilize the narrative of the we in order for people, political parties, to have political gain. In one of our earlier episodes, I had a chance to talk with Christopher R. Rogers, someone that I actually knew from my time in Chester, Pennsylvania, doing community work. He was in episode Building Bridges. He said communities often understand problems long before institutions are able to respond to them. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. Because democratic knowledge is not centralized. It is distributed, lived, already present. Communities do understand their problems long before the institutions are able to acknowledge them, respond to them, solve them. So when I take a step back and look at these conversations together, a structure begins to emerge. a system under pressure across multiple interconnected layers, perception, amplification, institutions, institutional redesign, rights, economics, geopolitics, meaning, behavior, and community knowledge. And none of these layers operate independently. They reinforce each other, or they weaken each other. Perception shapes trust. Trust shapes institutions. Institutions shape participation. Participation shapes outcomes. Meaning shapes interpretation. Economics shapes priorities. And communities feed back into the system. So, what we are dealing with is not a single crisis. It is a multi-layered system under simultaneous strain. And that brings us to a different kind of question. Not just what is going wrong, but what is actually being done in response. Because understanding these dynamics is important, but it's not sufficient on its own. I think everyone knows that democracy does not improve through analysis alone. All of the analysis hasn't improved democracy. It is actually through practice. The practice of democracy. Because again, democracy, it's alive, it's living. It's a living, breathing form of governance. It only improves through practice. It only improves through experimentation. It only improves through real-world effort. It only improves because of you. So this episode is both a reflection and a transition from understanding to action, from mapping the system to emerging with it directly. And in the next part of this season, that is exactly what we will be focused on. Real-world efforts to strengthen democratic systems, not in theory, but in practice. Not abstract ideas, but as lived attempts to respond to the challenges we've been talking about all year. So this episode marks a turning point. 1 year in, the goal is no longer only to understand democracy, it is to understand what it takes to sustain it. Because democracy is not self-sustaining. It depends on participation, on institutions, on rights, on economic choices, on global conditions, on shared meaning, and on continuous effort. So wherever you are in your relationships to politics, engaged, uncertain, or somewhere in between, you are part of that system. And what you do with that participation matters. So when you step inside democracy, instead of looking at it from a distance, something becomes clear. It is not a fixed system. It is a continuous process held together by participation, repetition, and attention. And what looks stable from the outside is actually constantly being rebuilt from the inside. Every conversation, every meeting, every decision, every moment of participation is part of that reconstruction or part of its erosion. So democracy is not something you observe once and understand. It is something you live inside and shape as you move through it. And that leads us to the next question. Because if democracy depends on participation, what happens when that participation is uneven? When some voices carry more weight than others? when some spaces stay active and others slowly fall silent. That is where we go next. Because understanding democracy is not enough anymore. Now we have to understand how it behaves under imbalance. We have to understand how it behaves when we push back towards stabilizing the system, repairing, and in some parts, rebuilding the infrastructure. Thank you for being part of this first year and for continuing into what comes next. If you like the podcast, please share, subscribe, write a review to help others find the podcast. And as usual, you can email me with questions, comments to tina@patternchangelab.com. Talk with you soon.